Hello, my name is Blaine Whitford. I use he series pronouns, and my presentation is entitled No Neutral Ground, the Activist Churches Confront Apartheid. At 1:10 in the morning of August 31st, 1988, a bomb exploded in the center of Johannesburg, South Africa. The bomb, expertly placed, caused severe damage to the Kotso house, and the building collapsed in on itself. 6 weeks later, another bomb was detonated in the city, this time destroying the Kana house. These attacks were the clarion call for churches everywhere. Both buildings were connected to church groups who, in the wake of the government's outlawing of secular anti-apartheid groups only months before, had taken a central role in protest against the government. The Kotso House, meaning House of Peace, was the headquarters of the South African Council of Churches, the SACC, as well as the offices of human rights, trade union, and detainee support groups. The Kana House was the office of the South African Council of Catholic Bishops, a Catholic counterpart to the largely Protestant SACC. Frank Chikane, then president of the SACC, said, quote, "This is connected to the witness and action of the churches," end quote. While it was certainly suspected at the time that the government had been involved in the attack, it was revealed during the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that not only had the Minister of Law and Order, Adrian Floek, overseen the attack, but the state president, P.W. Botha, had ordered it directly. The savagery of these 1988 bombings, the zenith, but certainly not the end of government activity against the churches, should not be overlooked. The government of South Africa was no stranger to violent suppression, both overt and covert, of its political enemies, but here its targets were not armed militants or protesters, but devoted clergy and laity. For decades, theologians, clergy, and church groups of all denominations had made condemnations and hosted ecumenical discussions about the South African system of apartheid, but never before had they been so directly confronted by the forces of the state. Henceforth, there was no more neutral ground, said Alan Bosak, then head of the World Alliance of Reformed Churches, in a 1989 interview. It was no longer, quote, protest against the government or resistance to evil. It was a question for us finally and ultimately of obedience to God. I don't think the government thought it would come to this, end quote. Obedience to God would not come until 1994, the year of South Africa's first truly democratic elections, which would elevate Nelson Mandela to the presidency. The conflict between the activist churches and the South African government did not emerge out of nowhere. It was the final apocalyptic clash of forces that had been brewing in South Africa before it had even been a nation. The government had acted out of fear and desperation because white supremacy was finally being threatened by a righteous and irrevocable enemy, black theology. Black theology and its advocates, like the venerable Desmond Tutu, have held a place in the history of South Africa's struggle for freedom for many decades now, although recent scholarship has shifted its interest away from black theology's role in the movement, relegating it to the position of a moral challenge to apartheid. My research will investigate the history and development of black theology in South Africa and emphasize its importance during the most critical years of anti-apartheid resistance, 1978 to 1991, in an attempt to argue that, far from being purely moral agents against apartheid, those advocates of black theology were critical drivers in the death of white minority rule. But what exactly is black theology? Black theology was not unique to South Africa, although it developed its own characteristics as the movement progressed. The first enunciation of black theology was put into print in the U.S. in 1969 by the late James H. Cone. Cone himself was influenced by the massive confluence of literature that emerged out of the movement referred to as liberation theology, which was a movement coming primarily out of Latin and South America. Liberation theologians were primarily Catholics, inspired by the Second Vatican Council, attempting to create a synthesis of left-wing socioeconomic analysis and Christian theology in the pursuit of social and economic justice. Cone's black theology, while certainly influenced by the socioeconomic synthesis of liberation theologians, was more concerned with the construction of a robust contextual theology, analyzing and centering blackness within systems of white supremacy. In South Africa, black theology was contextual as well, emerging under the pressures from both left-wing analysis and unique movements like the Black Consciousness movement led by Steve Biko. With these overlapping forces at play, black theology in South Africa emerged at a conjunction of both racialist and left-wing analysis. The most accurate understanding of black theology comes from Alan Bosak's 1977 work, Farewell to Innocence, where he claims, quote, black theology in South Africa is a theology of liberation, and it is this focus that makes the contextuality of Black theology truly ecumenical and universal. It is not an exclusive theological apartheid in which whites have no part. It is a passionate call to freedom, and although it directs its voice to Black people, it nonetheless hopes that white people will hear and be saved. The statement reflects Black theology's relationship with the two forces I mentioned, Black consciousness and leftism. Bosak clearly affirms Black consciousness, the Black consciousness laid out by Steve Biko, making clear that Black theology in South Africa is not catered to whites in the hopes that they liberate Blacks out of Christian pity, but Blacks that they might liberate themselves. However, Bosak makes clear that Black theology is a movement that is open to and perhaps necessitates white participation, with the redemption of whites from their own oppression being an integral part of the project and struggle against apartheid. It is also an appeal to a mass movement, not an exclusive racialist one. In this way, it borrows from the vision of leftist opposition to apartheid, while importantly shifting the center of focus away from class and towards race and the validity of Black lives, framed around a moral vision of Christianity. By the 1980s, after several decades of development, Black theology had grown in its power and influence into a powerful and complex force, made up of a variety of churches, headed by a variety of theologians, and carried out in the real world by a variety of social programs. The project of Black theology was a respectable force of opposition to the South African government. In 1982, Alan Bosak, who was then head of the Dutch Reformed Mission Church, a sister church to the state-supported Dutch Reformed Church in Africa, or NGK, gave a speech to the World Alliance of Reformed Churches, the international governing body of Reformed churches to which both the Dutch Reformed Mission Church and the Dutch Reformed Church in Africa belonged. His speech was a powerful condemnation of South African apartheid on doctrinal grounds, and it was so powerful that at the same meeting he was elected by members of the World Alliance of Reformed Churches to the head of the organization. In 1983, he led the world's Reformed churches in declaring apartheid a heresy, an act that would lead to the Dutch Reformed Church in Africa's expulsion from the World Alliance of Reformed Churches until 1986, when the church, breaking from the South African government, included racial equality as one of its statements of faith. The same year as the declaration of apartheid as a heresy, Bosak, along with a host of activist clergy and secular apartheid activists, organized the United Democratic Front, a mass movement of almost every element of social life in South Africa, from trade unions to churches to student groups, all of which were united against the racist and anti-democratic institution of apartheid, and, importantly, rallied under the banner of Black theology. The South African government, its moral authority shaken by both the declaration of apartheid as a heresy and a new wave of mass demonstrations against the government led by the United Democratic Front, backed itself into a corner. The state president, P.W. Botha, rather than acquiesce to the demands of protesters and activist churches, brought the full force of the state against its opponents, declaring 2 states of emergency in 2 years. The latter, issued in late 1986, would not be lifted for 20 months. Driven to the brink, a collection of Black theologians released a document anonymously in 1985 called the Kairos Document, or the KD. The KD was the most radical piece of Black theology to have been released at the time. While still rejecting a total synthesis with leftist analysis and emphasizing racial injustice a la the Black consciousness movement, the KD attacked the church itself as an institution and instrument of apartheid and white supremacy. It attacked what it called state theology, which it viewed as the dominant mode of Christian belief in South Africa at the time, referring specifically to the close relationship that the South African government and the Dutch Reformed Church in Africa held. State theology was repressive and called for true Christians to obey the law as it was, regardless of how brutal or unjust those laws were. The KD was not outlawed by the government. However, it did inspire many people to rise up against the government, and because of these actions, the government backlash against proponents of Black theology was immense. Black theology's influence on the anti-apartheid movement reached its zenith in 1988. In February, the state president outlawed a bevy of anti-apartheid organizations, including the United Democratic Front. Several weeks later, Anglican Archbishop Desmond Tutu sent out a call for churches, both Black and white, activist and conservative, to march on Parliament in protest. The march was attended in much higher numbers than Tutu expected, and was met with suppression and arrest by the government, who accused Tutu and other activist clergy involved as either being communist puppets or disingenuous demagogues. It was under this heightened period of confrontation that the bombings I mentioned at the beginning of my paper occurred. The state was engaged in total war with the activist churches, seeking to annihilate them rather than acquiesce to their demands. By 1989, however, the hardliner P.W. Botha, who had occupied the office of the presidency since 1983, had a stroke and resigned when was replaced with F.W. de Klerk, seen as a much softer reformer. The churches were, however, unconvinced of his commitment to peace and reform, and ordered another march on Parliament in 1989, and presented a list of demands to the new government. To their surprise, de Klerk acquiesced completely. In the coming years, the South African government, encouraged by the commitment to a peaceful transition and reconciliation espoused by activist churches and proponents of black theology, would engage in a long series of negotiations. It was the churches that centered black theology that ensured that previously exiled political parties like the ANC had a place at these negotiations. Ultimately, the 1994 election of the ANC, the African National Congress, the party to which Nelson Mandela belonged, the election of the ANC to power saw the churches retreat from their role in politics, with many leaders of the churches and proponents of black theology seeing their role as democratic midwife completed. Ultimately, black theology burned itself up and threw itself in support of the ANC and the new democratic government, so annihilating itself that a secular, multiracial South Africa could emerge from its ashes. Thank you.